Welcome to Military Analytics. Russia was struck with a wave of drone strikes overnight as authorities in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, said it was targeted with an attack that was unparalleled in density. The strikes were reported throughout Russia, including in the regions of Kursk and Bryansk, which are located near the border with Ukraine, and Smolensk in western Russia. Drone incidents inside Russian territory have been growing in intensity in recent weeks. On May 3rd, the press service of the Russian government accused Ukraine of crashing two drones into the Kremlin residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow, describing the alleged attack as a planned terrorist act and an attempt on Putin's life. Ukraine has denied any involvement in strikes inside Russia. Alexander Bogomazov, head of the Bryansk region, said on his Telegram channel on Tuesday that a Ukrainian drone was shot down by an air defense system in the town of Klintsy. There are no casualties. The balcony of a residential building was damaged. Operational services are working on the spot, Bogomazov wrote. Earlier on May 13th, Bogomazov said a drone attacked the territory, dropping ammunition onto the roof of a building in the town of Starodub. There were no casualties in that incident, he said. And on May 14th, police officers in the village of Gornoy were reportedly attacked by a drone that dropped an explosive device on their cars. On Tuesday, Kursk region Roman Starovoytov said on his Telegram channel that a Ukrainian drone dropped an explosive device on an excavator in the Sajansky district, injuring one person. The driver of construction equipment was slightly wounded in the shoulder, Starovoytov wrote. And in the Smolensk region, a drone with two cameras crashed on the territory of a medical facility belonging to Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs. The Telegram channel shot reported on Tuesday. The drone was found by a nurse who called the police, according to the Telegram channel. No explosives were found, and it was sent for further examination. 3 Russian academics who have worked on hypersonic missile technology face grave accusations, the Kremlin said on Wednesday in a treason investigation that has spread alarm through Russia's scientific community. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said he was aware of an open letter from Siberian scientists in defense of the men, but that the case was a matter for the security services. In the letter published on Monday, colleagues of Anatoly Maslov, Alexander Kiblya, and Valery Zvyagintsev protested their innocence and said the prosecutions threatened to inflict grave damage on Russian science. We know each of them as a patriot and decent person who is not capable of doing what the investigating authorities suspect them of, they said. President Vladimir Putin has boasted that Russia is the global leader in hypersonic missiles capable of traveling at speeds of up to Mach 10. 12,250 km per hour, to evade enemy air defenses. On Tuesday, Ukraine said it had managed to destroy 6 weapons in a single night, although Russia disputed this. Notices of academic conferences stretching back over many years show the arrested scientists were frequent participants. In 2012, Maslov and Shiblik presented the results of an experiment on hypersonic missile design at a seminar in Tours, France. In 2016, all 3 were among the authors of a book chapter entitled Hypersonic Short Duration Facilities for Aerodynamic Research in Russia. The open letter from their colleagues at the Kristianovich Institute of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics in Novosibirsk said the materials the scientists had presented in international forums had been checked repeatedly to ensure they did not include restricted information. The cases showed that any article or report can lead to accusations of high treason, the open letter said. In this situation, we are not only afraid for the fate of our colleagues, we just do not understand how to continue to do our job. The letter also cited the case of Dmitry Kocher, another Siberian scientist who was arrested last year on suspicion of state treason and flown to Moscow despite suffering from advanced pancreatic cancer. Kocher, a laser specialist, died 2 days later. It said such cases were having a chilling effect on young Russian scientists. Even now, the best students refuse to come to work with us. And our best young employees are leaving science. Several research areas that are critically important to laying the fundamental groundwork for the aerospace technology of the future are simply closing because employees are afraid to engage in such research. Asked about the letter, Kremlin spokesman Peskov said, "We have indeed seen this appeal, but Russian special services are working on this. They are doing their job. These are grave accusations. Losing control of occupied Crimea is a red line for Russian President Vladimir Putin," the Estonian defense minister has said. However, He urged fellow NATO nations not to balk at a Ukrainian operation towards the peninsula, despite fears over Moscow's nuclear arsenal. In an interview at the Estonian Defense Ministry last weekend on the sidelines of the Leonard Meri conference, Hanno Pevkur told Newsweek that NATO allies have channels by which to warn the Kremlin against nuclear weapon use, and that Putin's repeated atomic saber rattling should not undermine Western support for Kyiv. Our job here is to help Ukrainians and to be concerned that they can make their moves, Pevkur said. Not to be worried about what the Kremlin will do. Crimea occupies a significant place in Putin's national mythology. Its quick and remarkably bloodless seizure by Russian troops, known then as Little Green Men due to their lack of a logo or other identifiers, in 2014, was celebrated as evidence of Moscow's renewed confidence and capability, and a reversal of a historically perceived national humiliation. But Ukrainian troops may be looking toward the peninsula for their coming counteroffensive. A prosperous drive south from Zaporizhia and east from Kherson to sever the land bridge from Crimea to Russia could isolate the arm and imperil the hundreds of thousands of Russian troops and civilians there. Foreign officials have expressed concern that Kyiv's ambitions to retake the peninsula might prompt the Kremlin to escalate its war on Ukraine. However, Western officials have also said there is no immediate indication that Putin is considering nuclear weapons. Ukraine needs to take back all the territories, Pevkur told Newsweek when asked about the Crimea issue. The peninsula's fate, he added, will be partially down to the Russian response to the coming counterattack. Will there be an avalanche? Will they start to run? It is tough to say. When we talk about the same issue in maybe 1 month or 2 months, we will have more information, he said. But based on the public information that we have, then definitely Crimea is a red line for Putin. But we don't know what that red line means. We don't know when we are in the stage where Ukraine is ready to take Crimea, what the situation will be, or the current status of the Russian army. Maybe there is nothing to fight against. Perhaps the avalanche is enormous, and it will be a matter of months, or perhaps vice versa, and it will be a very long conflict. Perhaps, Pevkur added, Putin may no longer even be the commander-in-chief. I believe the Ukrainians hope so, he said. But when it's not Putin, it might be someone else with even more rage against the Ukrainians. You never know what the new leader will be like. NATO and the United States have channels to warn the Russian president against nuclear use. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan previously warned there would be catastrophic consequences for Moscow if it did resort to weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. But NATO has refrained from publicly detailing the subsequent steps it might take, instead opting for strategic ambiguity. Pevkur told Newsweek the approach is a sufficient warning for Putin. I believe that what NATO would do will never be published, he said. And this is right because there are channels for that to send the message to Russia regarding the nuclear threat. Nuclear attack. And definitely NATO and the allies will use these channels to send the right message. As to whether this message had already been sent, Pevkur said, there is no need to speculate. We have seen that Russia does poke the allies a bit. We saw that this threat stayed as a threat. It has to be like this when we wanted to achieve a real result. We will not do that publicly, especially not concerning the nuclear threat. Pevkur is among those urging caution over the imminent or perhaps already underway Ukrainian counterattack. It is essential we all understand that, the defense minister said. But let's not put too much pressure on the Ukrainians with that. Yes, this is why we also trained Ukrainian soldiers in Europe, also here in Estonia, and this is why we are sending military aid to Ukraine. But we need to hope that it will be as successful as it can be. But to put everything into context, the front line is 800 to 900 kilometers, and the full contact line is over 1,000 kilometers, about 621 miles, which is huge. Obviously, even when you have 12, maybe 13 new brigades, you still have more than 300,000 Russians. Every military understands that to have a very powerful counteroffensive, you need to have a ratio of 1-to-3 or 1-to-4 on your side, he said. This is why we have to take it quite calmly and not put too much pressure on the Ukrainians. Let's see how it goes. Ukraine hopes that Russia's mauled forces cannot withstand the offensive. Leaders in Kiev have clarified that a critical goal of the attritional winter and spring defensive battles in the east has been to sap Russian strength. Definitely they lost a lot of their excellent fighters even in the first months of the war, Pevkur said of the Russians. We all understand also that it's much easier to defend than to go on the offense. Even though the Russian army has been cut down in scale, they still have hundreds of thousands of men there. A guest on a Kremlin propaganda program has questioned whether Russians realize the gravity of the situation in Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. In a clip tweeted by journalist Julia Davis, the film director, Karen Shakhnazarov, explained on the Russia One channel how he always considered the worst-case scenario, and the war in Ukraine was no exception. In March, Shakhnazarov gave an equally downbeat view of Russia's chances in the war, saying on the same program, "We need to admit that we could lose. Maybe I am alarmist," he said in the latest clip. "But considering what might come in the war, what we are witnessing is a situation that is a lot more complex and dangerous than what happened during the Great Patriotic War," he said, referring to the Russian name for World War II. That he said that unlike in 1941, when Nazi Germany invaded, there was no unifying Soviet ideology that could bind the people together. "This danger is great," Shakhnazarov said, adding that Russia had been caught out by the delivery to Kiev of medium-range missiles which could hit Crimea, the peninsula annexed by Russia in 2014 that Ukraine has vowed to retake. What will happen in Crimea when the tourist season starts and the missiles start flying? He asked as he called for a realization that this is a most serious confrontation that is fateful for us. "This is truly a war," he said, "and not a special military operation, as the Kremlin describes it, which if Russia loses, means we will disappear. There will be no mercy. Look at their rhetoric for them. It is also a fateful war," he said. "We can't lose. If we lose, we will meet the fate of Native American tribes. And then books will be written. How Russia lost itself and Eurasia." The show's anchor, Vladimir Solovyev, took up the topic, saying that if Russia were to lose the ongoing war, we're taking the whole world with us. As he revisited themes about how Moscow should draw on its nuclear capabilities, Solovyev also made nuclear threats on his radio show Full Contact, following the reported interception by Ukraine of Russian missiles, including 6 hypersonic Kinzhals, which raised questions about Moscow's ability to evade Kiev's Western-supplied defense systems. "We haven't even come close to showing all our weapons," he said in a clip tweeted by the Kremlin, which posts videos of Russian propaganda shows on Twitter. Solovyev was referring to the potency of the Poseidon, an unmanned underwater vehicle reportedly capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear warheads. He described it as the perfect weapon against Britain. Russian President Vladimir Putin has failed miserably in his war against Ukraine. John Herbst, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, has told reporters. Herbst, the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, reflected on Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched nearly 15 months ago, and said Putin has had a very bad year. The Kremlin has sought to frame the Russian invasion as a special military operation against Ukraine and a battle for Russia's survival. In March, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that a foreign policy strategy recently adopted by Putin identifies the West as posing an existential threat to Russia. The Russian leader has been trying to convince Russians that the war is existential but with little success, said Herbst. Putin has failed miserably, the former diplomat said, pointing to public discussion on the war from Russian military bloggers and sites that typically publish Kremlin propaganda. Herbst said he saw a post last week which said Russia would perform better in the war if the population truly believed the war was an existential one for the country. Interesting. They don't believe it because it's a preposterous idea. It's an existential war for Ukraine, which is why they are fighting bravely. For Russia, it's Putin's war of choice, said Herbst. Just weeks into Putin's full-scale invasion in March 2022, Herbst told reporter that the war had been an unmitigated disaster for the Russian president. The former ambassador said on Tuesday that Putin's obvious failure in Ukraine is placing at a significant and growing strain on his regime. A year ago, Putin had lost the battle for Kiev and the battle for Kharkiv, but his forces had regrouped and were making slow but notable progress in Donbass. In April, May of 2022. In June, Ukraine received the HIMARS high-mobility artillery rocket systems from us, and by August they began a counter-offensive which took back more than 50% of the land that Moscow had seized since the big invasion. Now Russia is losing territory in Bakhmut, said Herbst, referring to counterattacks from Kiev in the small industrial city where Russian and Ukrainian forces have clashed since last summer. There's no real Russian counteroffensive this year, and Ukraine is preparing for another counteroffensive. Moscow is doing even worse now than it did then a year ago. Analysts greatly overestimated Russian strength, added Herbst. Herbst's remarks came as Kiev's military, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, said more than 200,000 Russian troops have been liquidated in the conflict so far. Moscow lost 10 soldiers over the past 24 hours, according to the Ukrainian military. Russia doesn't regularly release its casualty figures. In January, Moscow said that less than 6,000 of its troops have died, along with fewer than 4,000 additional fighters from Russia's so-called People's Republics in Ukraine's occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Heat prospects are even more worrying over Moscow's war in Ukraine. A Russian state television host has said, following the promise of further weapons supplies to Ukraine. On Monday, the UK government said it would send Kyiv hundreds of air defense missiles and long-range attack drones, which it said would have a range of more than 200 kilometers or 125 miles. The new weapons will be delivered to the Ukrainian military in the coming months, London said, as they are intended to help Ukraine in their anticipated military surge to counter Russian forces. On Thursday, British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said long-range Storms Shadow cruise missiles are now going into or are in Ukraine already without confirming the number of missiles sent. We are extremely negative about this, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said on Monday, adding it would lead to further destruction and retaliatory actions. Monday's announcement came ahead of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's arrival in the UK, meeting with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the leader's country estate Chequers today in the wake of the new weapons pledges from London that the prospects are even more worrying. Russian state media host Olga Skabeva said in a clip posted to Twitter by Anton Gorchenko, an advisor to Ukraine's Interior Ministry. We should treat these issues of weapons and military equipment as seriously as possible, Russian military commentator Mikhail Kudrenu added in the translated clip. We really do need to prepare thoroughly and with necessary precautions, Kudrenu said. We shouldn't succumb to bravado. Since the UK confirmed the delivery of Storm Shadow missiles, Russia has claimed Kyiv has used the new long-range capabilities in the eastern Luhansk region, which forms part of the contested Donbass. On Monday, Russia's defense ministry said in a post to Telegram that it had intercepted a Storm Shadow missile but did not offer further information. Kyiv's Western allies had been reluctant to commit long-range strike capabilities to Ukraine, with the U.S. refusing to provide ATACMS or Army tactical missile systems, which have a range of around 300 kilometers or 186 miles. These new weapons pledged by the UK mark a very substantial development because they make targets far behind the front lines, suddenly within Ukraine's reach. Fabian Hoffman, a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo, Norway, told Newsweek on Monday the new cruise missiles will likely be used for high-value targets that other weapons systems struggle to reach. He added, with the promised drones able to cause very substantial damage on less fortified areas behind the front lines ahead of arriving in the UK. Zelensky also secured new weapons packages from several of Ukraine's continental European allies, including Germany and France.